Good evening, everyone. My name is Sherry Soltani, and welcome to Today TV. Everyone in BC is encouraged to take the BC Demographic Survey to help identify systematic racism in government services. The survey is online and available in 15 different languages. Please go ahead and fill out the survey. Now, for those who do not have a computer or access to a smartphone or access to a computer, they can actually call by a toll-free number, which you can see on the screen. Now, last week in our program, we have covered information about BC survey and systematic racism. Today, we are continuing with Shawn a member of the Indigenous community who is with the unique Get Together Society to learn more about their culture, history, and their involvement to the community.
Yeah, thank you, Sherry, for having me on. Really appreciate the opportunity to share a little bit about my knowledge and experience. So, yeah, pretty excited to be here. And yeah, thank you for having me on.
Thank you and welcome to our show. Now, please tell us a little bit about yourself, Shawn.
Sure. Yeah, so, before I begin, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge that I live, work, and play on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples, as well as the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam nations. I also want to say a few words in my Indigenous language, which is Anishinaabe Mawin. And so goes Boju, Mishikia no Kut Nikaz, Magizian Totem, Wabagano Skygun and Donji, Vancouver and Donjiba. And so essentially what that translates to is my Anishinaabe name is Red Cloud. I'm part of the Eagle Clan. The community I'm part of is Wabigoon Lake Ojibwe Nation, and I was born in Vancouver. And so, yeah, that's just, a little bit about myself to get us started.
Thank you. And what's your involvement with Unique Get Together Society?
Yeah, so, I've had an opportunity to work for UGTS for about 2 years now. Some of the work that we've done includes hosting a community sweat lodge in North Vancouver. This was for the National Day of Truth and Reconciliation. And so that was what we did last year. And we're actually doing another one this year for the same reason. Let's see, what else is there? And so recently we conducted the anti-racism legislation focus groups. And so we had two focus groups that we did at our office in Vancouver. And we're going to be doing a third one in-house. And then after that, send in our final report to the government. So,
And
yeah,
thank you
that's
for being involved with Persian community. I do really appreciate that as well. To the past sessions that we had, and then this one here. Now, to you, Shawn, what is systematic racism, and what impact does it have on the Indigenous community?
yeah, no, that's a great question. I think there's maybe a few different ways that you could go about defining it. But the way that I perceive systemic racism is that there are certain components within society, certain functions of government, certain systems such as like the justice system, just certain things that are in place that make it difficult for an Indigenous person to thrive, and that there are a lot of barriers in place that that can make that challenging, right? And so historically speaking, there's been all kinds of examples of systemic racism, right?
Yes.
Including the Indian Act, residential schools, the 60s scoop, et cetera, et cetera. The Indian Act was legislation that was created in 1876 So this was like over almost 150 years ago, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so essentially, what this policy did, it was responsible for the creation of the reserve system, the band system. It made it mandatory for Indigenous children at that time to attend residential schools. It made it so that Indigenous people couldn't vote. It was also responsible for the creation of the status system, so status cards,
Mm-hmm.
and so it was very patriarchal, and essentially the government defined who and who wasn't an Indigenous person at that time, and so it kind of had various components to it that kind of had these different layers of oppression and really just constrained an individual's livelihood at that time.
Mm-hmm. So it was a very rough time, I guess.
Yeah, no, it really was. And so,
Do you have
you
any
know,
history that or a story that you want to share with us?
yeah, I don't know. I think that, it's just one of those situations where, this was written so long ago, and yet it still continues to have an effect on people's lives. Um, but unfortunately, we're not in a position to abolish it either.
Mm-hmm.
And so, it's really unfortunate that despite all the negative components about it, especially historically, in a lot of ways, like the main reason why it's still in place is because it forces the government to honor its fiduciary responsibilities to Indigenous communities.
Mm-hmm.
And so, what the answer is to that, what the solution is to that, I'm not sure. So, but
Mm-hmm.
yeah,
Now, we talked about the Indian Act, we talked about the historical effects that it happened to the indigenous community. Now, tell us about the ban system, particularly in the indigenous community, and what was the outcome of it?
yeah. So essentially, the Indian Act. So as I mentioned, so with the creation of reserves, each reserve essentially had what they call a band list.
Mm-hmm.
If you were on a band list, you were afforded certain rights and benefits and that sort of thing. Um, but but yeah, one of the major flaws with the band system is that it's predicated on a 2-year election cycle.
Mm-hmm.
And so at first glance, that may not seem like a big deal, but there actually have been plenty of examples of, this really makes it difficult for communities to make progress because you say you have a chief and council that comes in, after 6 months, they start to find their footing and that sort of thing, establishing business relationships, getting an economic development project on the go, and that sort of thing. And then 2 years passes, the next election happens,
Mm-hmm.
and then they don't get voted in, and then someone else comes in, and then what if they decide, you know what, I don't really want to do that anymore. We're going to go in a different direction.
Mm-hmm.
And so I've certainly seen examples of that. And and so anyways, the reason I bring that up is because I think that that's something that needs to change. Every other provincial, municipal, federal government system is based on a 4-year system.
Mm-hmm.
So there's no reason why that shouldn't be the case within Indigenous communities. I think it's important that people are aware of some of these issues. Um, actually, one of the things I do on the side is I actually facilitate workshops for a crown corporation, and so it's kind of an opportunity to educate the general public on some of these issues. And so we're starting to see more and more of that. I think
Mm-hmm.
ever since the 94 calls to action that were passed in 2015. Ever since then, we're slowly, starting to see changes within society, which is good. So, I mean, there's still a lot of work ahead, but, I
Yeah.
think that there's been
Now,
significant. Just
Of course, yeah. You know, there's an expression they said, the final nail in the coffin. What is that expression stands for?
well, I mean, in general, usually that means the final blow to an opponent or an enemy or what have you, right? Um, but anyways, when you say that, what comes to mind for me is this idea of race shifting. And so, in the last 10 or 15 years, for one reason or another, there's been situations where a non-indigenous person will claim to have an indigenous identity for financial benefit, right? For example, a person goes to university and they check the box that says, I'm indigenous, right?
But they're
And then when
not.
they go, but they're not
Hmm.
exactly. They're not, and so they go to apply for bursaries and scholarships, and they get put at the top of the list because we're in a time where being indigenous is favorable in that environment.
Hmm.
And so there have been, countless examples of people, pretending to be an indigenous person when they're not.
Hmm.
And it just feels like it's the final act of, colonial oppression or whatever you want to call it. It's just like, it just feels like this is something that never ends. It's like everything that happened in history, isn't bad enough. It's like now that we actually have something good going for ourselves, it's like, oh, you know what? We're going to take some of the piece of the pie too, because, we're just going to pretend to be. And so the term they use for that, they call them pretend Indians. That's the, derogatory
Hmm.
term. But yeah, it's really unfortunate. It's really sad that people would actually go out of their way to do that, and
Yeah,
so
it's
it's
sad to hear that, they actually wanted to take the privilege of being, indigenous by not being indigenous to just use the system, benefits. Um, Now, how do you feel when when we talk about the historical, uh, psychological things that happened in past to your ancestors? And I know because I spoke to you before that happened to you when you were a kid as well. How do you cope with that, and how do you feel about what happened?
yeah, no, it's a great question. So let's see here. Yeah, certainly, there have been plenty of situations that that I have found myself in, as a child, as a youth, as an adult, that were deeply challenging. And I don't think that there's a simple solution to that, right? What that might look like for one person might be different for someone else. But one of the things that we're kind of starting to see now is this idea of cultural resurgence. So more and more Indigenous people, are starting to reclaim and kind of find, their culture, like their culture
Mm-hmm.
again, right? Because this
Mm-hmm.
is something that was lost for a significant amount of time, as a result of residential schools and that sort of thing. And so in the last, 10 or 20, 30 years, you're starting to see, sun dances come back and,
It's
new sun
beautiful, I
dances
know.
starting. Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, it's beautiful. And I think it's a beautiful culture. And myself, I really do want to learn more. And I'm sure our audiences want to learn more. And I do like it when you actually have invited me to one of your seminars. And I wish I can, come more often to see those seminars. Now, it is a beautiful culture, and I hope that everybody will learn more about your culture. I know there's different languages that you speak within your community. Am I correct?
Well, no, I'm not a fluent speaker. I mean, I just know bits and pieces, right? Like certain
Mm-hmm.
phrases, certain
Mm-hmm.
words, and that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
But now that you mention that, though, that is definitely one of the current issues that does affect a lot of communities. Is this idea of revitalizing our languages? How do
Yes.
we go about doing that, right? Like, what are we going to do? Because there's less and less fluent speakers that are present as time moves forward. So it's like we're in a situation where we got to kind of scramble and try and make sure that our languages don't go extinct, right? So I think there needs to be maybe the government can put more funding towards language revitalization programs and that
Or
sort
there
of
should
thing.
be a school, maybe. There should be a school learning more about your languages, like especially for Indigenous young people that they actually want to learn the language. They could be in a school for them, right?
Um, well, I mean, when I was in high school, there was a Ojibwe class, they called it. I remember his name was Mr. Sky. And anyways, I mean, yeah, it was okay, I guess. But in terms of what you're saying, what some communities are doing is, so a few examples are, they call them language nests.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's like a building in the community where once you enter the building, the only thing that's spoken is the language, right? And so it's
Mm-hmm.
it's meant to this idea of immersion, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then even back home in Ontario, they have these language camps. And so one of my cousins told me that while you're there, um, 95% of the time you speak Anishinaabe, and the
Oh,
only time you speak English is in an emergency or if you have to ask a question and you don't quite, and so it's about immersing people in the language, for like 2 or 3 weeks at a time. It's out in nature, and so you're kind of camped out there, and it's a beautiful thing, right? So yeah,
mm-hmm.
there's definitely an effort being made to make that happen.
Yes. Now, um, what is 3Ds? I mean, I have heard about it, but I don't know exactly what is 3Ds.
Yeah, no, fair enough. So basically, like, I mean, there have been treaties even before the Indian Act, but essentially, in general, they're usually some type of agreement between two different parties, right? So in some cases, it can be two different governments or whatever. One of the earliest examples of a treaty in Canada, from what I remember, is the Wampum Belt. And so that was actually a physical thing that was created, and it symbolized the relationship between, I believe it was the Mohawk and the French at that time.
Oh,
But to answer your question, in Canada, so shortly after the Indian Act, the government began this process of what they call the numbered treaties.
mm-hmm.
And so there's about 9 or 10 of these treaties that are throughout Canada. And essentially, they represent, like a geographical area, similar to a province, right? But except it's a treaty area. And so it starts off in the east, right, with Treaty One. And so that includes, maybe 20 to 40 Indigenous communities, and they're all kind of clumped together as being part of that treaty.
I see.
And then as you move further west, they're just kind of all over the place on the map. And so my community is part of Treaty 3. And so, what's part of that is, there are some benefits that are associated with that. But in general, the issue with the number of treaties is that when they were written over 100 years ago, many Indigenous leaders at that time, they may have spoken English, but English probably wasn't their first language. And
Of
then on
course not.
top of
Yeah.
that, yeah, and then on top of that, they probably didn't read or write in English, right? Because back then, a lot of people were illiterate back then, right? Like we're
Hmm.
talking the late 1800s, early 1900s. And so these treaty agreements, these treaties were written in English, right, at a time when, this wasn't our first language. And so, anyways, yeah, that's one of the biggest issues revolving them is that there was this language barrier. And so both sides walked away from those treaty agreements with a different understanding as to what those meant.
I see.
Uh, what many, what I was told is that, the indigenous leaders at that time understood these treaties to be a sharing of the land and resources, right?
Hmm.
But the government understood those treaties to mean, oh, well, now we can just take whatever we want and do whatever we want. And
Hmm.
so basically, it was a bad faith occurrence because there was a misunderstanding, there was a language barrier, and unfortunately, they were written in English at a time when that just wasn't our first language, and so and they still they still exist, they're still in place, and so I feel like that's something that needs to be either rewritten or renegotiated, renegotiated on good faith, because one side clearly benefited from that arrangement and
Hmm.
another side didn't.
I
So,
see,
yeah.
which was very unfair to Indigenous community as well. Shawn, do you think the BC survey has made a positive impact in addressing systematic racism? Or do you believe that additional measures behind the survey are necessary to combat these issue effectively?
Yeah, I mean, certainly, it's obviously a step in the right direction. But often the criticisms revolving scenarios like this is that usually it's viewed as not being enough, right? People want more to be done, or feel that more could be done. And and fair enough, given the history of Canada and everything that's kind of happened. But aside from that, though, I do feel like it is a step in the right direction. Ideally, the government will continue to build off of legislation like this and kind of continue to kind of push it in that direction. I think that one of the things that we gotta realize is that unfortunately the wheels of the government kind of turn really slow, right? So it's one of those things
Yeah.
that it's hard to predict.
Yeah. Racism is all over the place. We're not only talking about, indigenous community. We're talking about newcomers who comes to BC. We're talking about different communities with different, race and different languages, even different religion. When they come to Canada, it does impact them as well, especially in the society, especially even the kids going to school and they get bullied sometimes because they have a different race and different, language or even different food or different religion. Now, what do you think and what do you believe that the system should do to encourage people to understand more about anti-racism and about this whole situation?
Well, I think one of the first steps, is to continue to educate, the general public, and then also, introducing this material, into schools, right, at the elementary level, high school, etc., and just kind of creating more awareness about this, right?
Hmm.
Because I think often, especially kids, as soon as they learn something and they kind of make a connection, they're more likely to, smarten up, so to speak, right? Oftentimes, racist acts, situations of racism are often, based on ignorance, right?
Hmm.
People are just, they just don't know. And and so no, that's not to justify it, right? Like, that's not what I'm saying.
Yes, I
But
understand.
but I feel like, yeah, just continuing to educate people on this topic. And and then even just like conversations like this, conversations in general, like out in the public, and just kind of continuing to create this awareness. I think in a lot of ways our society is kind of going through this update period, right? Similar to how a computer updates itself, right? And so
Mm-hmm.
we're kind of in the process of making that happen. And so I think
Mm-hmm.
if we compare now to, like, say 50 years ago, we certainly made some strides
Some
in that time.
progress. Yeah. Yeah. Well, Shawn, I really do appreciate all the details. I want to learn more. I'm telling you that this is not enough for me. Like, I mean, for myself, I really do want to learn more about your culture and your community. And I wanted to show it to our audiences as well. And it is a beautiful culture. And I know that together we can have a better Canada. Like because Canada is a multicultural country, so together we can have a better society, better environment, and better Canada. Now, do you have anything to say for us at the end?
No, I just want to, say thank you again, Sherry. And I also want to, say thank you to the Middle Peace Society, Poran, and Samira.
Samira, yeah, mhm.
Samira, yeah, and
Yes.
yeah, just acknowledge that the Persian community was very welcoming. And and yeah, it was just nice. It felt really good to be there, and so I'm very grateful for that. So yeah, thank you for that, and thank you for having me on the show. So yeah,
Do
thank
you
you.
want to say goodbye in your languages for us?
I'll just say miigwech. So yeah,
Miigwech.
yeah,
Miigwech
means
to you
thank
all, and thank you
you.
for watching us. See you next time.